I stood outside the mansion I once helped buy with $200,000, watching a sparkling dinner unfold inside. There were candles, wine, laughter, but no place for me. My son's message echoed in my mind. Mom, tonight's dinner is for the in-laws. Just rest at home. I had no seat at the table, only my reflection on the glass. But then, I discovered an audio recording from my hearing aid where my daughter-in-law called me a walking ATM. From that moment, I stopped waiting for a chair. I built the whole stage myself. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Hit the subscribe button now to catch the next shocking episode from us. I never imagined a cold text message would become the final cut after a lifetime of sacrifice. But from that moment on, I finally began to live. It was 4:37 p.m. on Christmas Eve. The Gardner house, if one could still call it that, was quiet. Too quiet. A strange kind of quiet, the kind that hummed with things unsaid with waiting. Helen Gardner, 73, stood in front of the antique mirror in her small rental unit, just outside suburban New Haven. The light from the table lamp cast soft golden shadows across the walls, glinting off the small silver cross she always wore around her neck. Her hands moved with careful precision, smoothing the front of a navy blue blouse, worn but ironed, buttoned all the way up, just like she used to wear for parent-teacher conferences back in her days as a second-grade teacher. The skirt matched, modest, respectful. She adjusted the clasp of her pearl earrings, fake pearls, but she'd worn them for 40 years like they were heirlooms, and took one last look in the mirror. She didn't look glamorous, but she looked neat, presentable, like someone who expected to be seen. She glanced at the clock. Dinner was at 6:30. That left time to stop by the florist and pick up the poinsettia she always brought. Carla didn't like real plants, said they were messy, but it was tradition. Helen always brought something. Her eyes flicked to the small gift bag on the counter. Inside was a framed photograph of Daniel as a boy about 8 years old, clinging to her arm at the county fair. She'd found it a few days ago while going through storage. She had spent 2 hours cleaning the frame, wrapping it in tissue paper. It felt right to give it to him tonight. Tonight was supposed to be different. It was the first Christmas since she sold the family home, the one with creaky floors, a fireplace that never quite drew properly, and the faded wallpaper James had picked out before his heart gave out on the lawnmower. She had cried the day she handed over the keys, but Daniel had insisted. Mom, you'll be closer. Carla wants you to feel like part of the family. Part of the family. Helen reached for her coat when the vibration buzzed from the kitchen table. She froze mid-step, then slowly turned. Her phone sat screen up next to the gift bag, blinking. One message from Daniel. Her lips curled, slightly hopeful. Maybe they were running late. Or maybe he needed her to pick up something from the store. Carla often forgot napkins or wine. Helen grabbed her glasses from the counter, slipped them on, and tapped the screen. Hey, Mom, quick change. Tonight's just Carla's family. Kinda a Gardner-free zone, lol. We'll catch up tomorrow, okay? Rest up tonight. The message hit her like a slap. Not the words, but the familiarity of them. The tone. Casual dismissal wrapped in emoji-laced politeness. She read it again, slower this time, eyes scanning for some mistake, some follow-up, a just kidding, or maybe a line that said Carla's idea, not mine, but nothing came. She stared at the screen. The edges of her vision narrowed like her entire living room was shrinking away, leaving only those lines of text glowing coldly in her hand. Her fingers trembled. Not with age, though arthritis certainly had its say, but with something deeper, the kind of tremble that comes when something long suspected is finally confirmed. She set the phone down, not gently. The sound of it hitting the glass coaster echoed in the room, then silence. The Christmas lights on the little artificial tree flickered beside her chair. She had bought it 2 weeks ago after Daniel told her not to bother dragging out all that old junk. Carla thought Helen's nativity figurines were a little intense for their minimalist decor. Helen hadn't said anything. Not then. She sat down, slowly smoothing her skirt as she folded her hands in her lap. Her heart was still racing, that damn message. Gardner free. She thought of the chair that had been placed at the far end of the dining table last Thanksgiving, halfway between the kitchen and the guests, awkwardly situated like an afterthought. She had told herself it didn't mean anything. She thought of the accidental missed calls, the way Carla had corrected her when she tried to tell a story, the sudden silence when she entered the room during their housewarming last summer. Still, she had told herself, they're just busy, they're young, they're stressed. Now she could hear her late husband's voice in her head. People will only take advantage of you as far as you let them. James had always been that way, blunt, a little rough around the edges, but honest. Brutally honest. He had been wary of Carla from the beginning. A ladder climber, he'd called her. Helen had scolded him for it. Give her time, she'd said. Time, it seemed, had only confirmed his instinct. She stood up again, slowly walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the snow was falling now, slow, elegant flakes drifting down beneath the yellow light of the street lamp. The world looked clean out there, untouched, but inside, she felt dirty, small, forgotten. Her hand dropped from the curtain. She turned back toward the living room and stared at the bag on the table, the gift for Daniel. That boy in the photo clinging to her arm. She had raised him alone after James passed. Woke up at 5 every morning for 20 years to pack lunches, review spelling lists, drive to band practice, bake last-minute cupcakes. She had missed her own retirement party because Carla went into early labor with Abby. She sat in the hospital waiting room for 8 hours while everyone else celebrated the end of her 38-year career with sheet cake and balloons. Helen walked over to the tree and unplugged the lights. The room went dim. Not dark, but dim in a way that made the corners feel farther away. She didn't cry. She was past that. Her heart was too tired for crying. But she stood there for a long time staring at that unplugged tree, the silence closing in like snowfall. She sat back down in the armchair, folded her hands again, and looked around. The walls of this rental were beige and personal, but she had tried to make them feel like home. Photos lined the mantel, Daniel in his graduation cap, Abby at her 8th birthday, James standing beside the old canoe. She got up and walked to the hallway closet, took down a box labeled Christmas, Old House, and opened it. Inside were ornaments, worn and mismatched, some from her childhood, others homemade by Daniel when he was little. A reindeer made from clothespins, a snowflake cut from old math homework. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. He'd written to Mommy in shaky pencil on the back. Helen closed the box, gently this time. She took the gift bag and walked it to the bedroom. Set it in the drawer, not the trash. Not yet. She wasn't ready to throw that away, but she also wasn't going to carry it tonight like some fool waiting at a locked door. She returned to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and stood in the doorway waiting. The minutes ticked by slowly. A wind gust hit the windows. Somewhere a car door slammed. In someone else's house, people were hugging, clinking glasses, pulling turkeys out of ovens. She reached for her favorite mug, the one James had given her on their 20th anniversary. The print had faded from years of washing best teacher, best mom, best friend. She poured the water, dunked the tea bag, and waited. No one called, no one texted again. But the room at least stayed steady, warm, still. And for the first time in months, Helen began to see clearly. They hadn't just forgotten to set a place for her. They never intended to. Under the dim light of the kitchen, Helen Gardner sat with both hands wrapped around her cup of tea, untouched. The steam had long stopped rising, but she hadn't noticed. Not really. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at the window where the snow had now dusted the sill like powdered sugar. The message from Daniel still pulsed in her mind like a migraine she couldn't shake. Rest up tonight. That phrase stuck almost more than the Gardner-free zone. It was a pat on the head, a dismissal cloaked in concern. Helen had taught hundreds of children to recognize passive aggression. Now she was the lesson plan. Her breathing was steady, but beneath the quiet and the stillness, something shifted. Memory. It came like a wave, not gentle but cold and immediate. Spring almost 2 years ago, the day she stood in front of the for sale sign on her old house, her home of 41 years. The shutters had always needed paint. The hydrangeas along the fence were wild, a bit unruly but beautiful when they bloomed. James had planted them. Daniel had stood beside her in his crisp polo shirt, his voice careful, persuasive. "Mom, this is what's best. You don't need to rattle around this big old house by yourself. You'll be 10 minutes away from us. You'll see Abby every weekend. And the new house, it'll be ours." He'd used the word ours like a promise. Carla hadn't said much during the visit. She was on her phone the entire time, standing in the shade, tapping, rapidly smiling at something Helen couldn't see. The plan had sounded generous. Helen would sell the house, contribute to the down payment of a new property, a large modern home where Daniel's family could grow. And Helen could live on the main floor like a queen, Daniel had said. "It's not even about money," he'd added quickly, sensing her hesitation. "It's about closeness, family. That's what matters now, right?" Helen had smiled, nodded, hugged him too tightly because in that moment she wanted it to be true. She wanted to believe that this was what it meant to grow old with grace, to be needed, to be woven into her family's daily life, to matter. She remembered the last morning in the old house, packing the final box in the kitchen. The sun had poured through the window just right, the way it always did in early May, and she'd stopped to take it in. "I hope this was the right thing," she had whispered aloud to no one. Later, she signed a check, $200,000, a family contribution the mortgage broker had called it. Quite a sum, he'd added, eyebrows raised. Helen had smiled politely, her stomach tightening just a bit. But that feeling, the doubt, she buried it quickly. Daniel had held her hand after the closing. "This house is yours too, Mom. We're building something together." Those words echoed now like hollow bells. The house, once a dream, had turned out to be a fortress, with her assigned to the servants' quarters. Helen blinked and returned to the present, still seated at the kitchen table in her rental, the tea still cold. Her reflection in the window looked older than she remembered. Back then, the new house had felt full of possibility. She had moved into the guest suite on the first floor tucked away beside the laundry room. At first, Carla had been cordial, smiling in a strained way, overly enthusiastic about boundaries. "Let's set some expectations up front," she'd said one evening, notebook in hand like she was running a staff meeting. "You'll always have your space and we'll have ours. Let's just respect that." Helen had agreed. Of course, she was grateful after all. In the beginning, she'd offered to help folding laundry, cleaning dishes, prepping school lunches. Carla had smiled. "You don't have to, Helen, but if you insist," and so she did. And then it became assumed, then expected. She had not been invited to the Sunday brunches when Carla's influencer friends came over. She had been asked politely not to overshare stories about the past, especially ones that weren't on brand for their lifestyle. She had learned to stay quiet during dinner because Carla didn't like it when Helen corrected Abby's grammar. And once when Helen suggested turning off the phones during family meals, Carla had laughed and said, "Oh, Helen, this isn't 1950. The walls had started to close in. One memory, however, dug deeper than the rest. It resurfaced now uninvited as memories do. It was her last birthday. She had woken up early, as always, expecting at least a card on the breakfast table. There was none. No text, no call. By 11 a.m., she'd started convincing herself they were planning a surprise. By 2 p.m., she'd baked her own lemon pound cake, just in case. By 5:30 p.m., the house was empty. Carla had taken Abby to a ballet recital. Daniel was working late. She had eaten one small slice of the cake at the kitchen island, alone. The candle was the only light in the room. She didn't sing. She didn't even make a wish. Wishes were for people who thought things could still change. When Daniel came home, he kissed her on the cheek and said, "Oh my God, was it today?" like he was surprised his own mother still aged. Helen hadn't cried that night. She was beyond tears. But she had stayed up until 2 a.m. watching home videos on her iPad, videos of birthdays past when she used to throw backyard parties for Daniel with treasure hunts and homemade crowns. That night marked the beginning of the unraveling. Quiet, invisible, but undeniable. In the days that followed, her offers to help were met with shorter replies. Carla had started suggesting that Helen spend more time in her room so we don't get under each other's feet. Abby had stopped knocking on her door to ask for help with homework. Daniel had become like a polite landlord, cordial but distant. He only called her mom when he needed something. And now the message tonight, the final confirmation. The exclamation point at the end of a long sentence of being erased. She picked up the cup again, still cold. In her mind, she walked through the rooms of that house again, the one she'd helped pay for. She saw the framed photo of Carla's curated family portrait on the mantel, a perfect image, all whites and creams and muted smiles. Helen had once asked why she wasn't in it. Carla had smiled tightly. "It's just for the brand, Helen. You know, cohesion." Cohesion, another word for exclusion. Helen stood slowly and walked to the bookshelf. Her fingers found a photo album one Daniel had made her years ago for Mother's Day. It was labeled "Best Mom Ever," scrawled in a crayon font on the cover. She flipped through it now. Page 1, Daniel in preschool, clutching her hand, grinning. Page 4, James grilling in the backyard, waving with tongs in the air. Page 7, Helen in the classroom, surrounded by kids. Page 10, Daniel at his college graduation. She was next to him, smiling proud. None of those memories existed in the new house. She closed the album, pressed her hand to the cover, and exhaled. She wasn't sad anymore. Not exactly. Not in the way she had been before. This was something colder, more crystalline, a clarity that stung. They had taken her money, her time, her presence, and repackaged her into something inconvenient, something outdated, but not anymore. She reached for the phone and placed it face down. No more watching it light up with the wrong kind of messages. She was beginning to feel the outlines of something new forming in her, something forged not from revenge, but from reclamation. The fire wasn't fury, not yet. It was something better. Resolve, and this time there would be no more seats pulled away from her. Because she was done waiting for a place at their table. She'd build her own. Helen sat back down at her kitchen table, the silence thick around her like fog rolling off the harbor. The tea had long gone cold. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkened screen of her phone, still lying face down like a body after a blow. The message from Daniel had done more than bruise. It had confirmed something she'd fought to ignore for too long. She inhaled slowly. Her hand reached to her left instinctively where James would have sat if he were alive. He would have had a snarky remark for Daniel, something crude but accurate. James never let people walk over him. She, on the other hand, had called it patience, grace, family loyalty. Now she could call it what it really was, silence dressed up as love. She stood, moved to the side table where she kept the old laptop, the one Daniel said she should replace, but which worked perfectly fine, thank you very much. She plugged it in, pressed the power button, and waited as the familiar hum came to life. Her fingers, stiff but steady, navigated through her online banking portal. She remembered the passwords without hesitation. 38 years of teaching had trained her mind to catalog everything down to the tiniest detail. She opened the account summary. Then she saw it. 12. 12 automated monthly payments, all active, all outgoing, all tied to her name. She clicked one by one through the list. $850 mortgage payment for the home Daniel insisted was ours. Warren $200, Abby's private school tuition, because Carla said public schools weren't future forward. $175, Carla's gym membership, the one with eucalyptus towels and valet parking. $300, car insurance for Daniel's SUV. $90, Abby's ballet classes. $130, weekly house cleaner, because Carla couldn't keep up with both social media and mopping. $62, Daniel's phone bill, still under her name somehow. $270, monthly HOA fees. $480, Carla's business coaching subscription. $99, streaming service bundle. $65, monthly wine club Carla never drank but posted about. $1,000, unspecified family allowance, a general fund transfer Daniel had set up a year ago. Helen leaned back and exhaled sharply like she'd just witnessed a crime. And in a way, she had. This wasn't generosity. This wasn't support. This wasn't family. It was theft in slow motion. She stared at the numbers. She'd always told herself that giving made her feel useful, that it kept her close, that family should help each other. But this wasn't help. It was a subscription to be tolerated. 12 lines on a screen, each one a tether tied around her throat. Her eyes hardened. She clicked on the Settings tab, found the section labeled Scheduled Transfers. There was a little checkbox next to each one, and next to each checkbox, Cancel. She hovered for a moment, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Then she started clicking. 1, 2, 3. By the time she hit the 12th, her hands had stopped shaking. She confirmed the cancellations. Then in the menu bar, she clicked into her Profile Management tab. The name Daniel Gardner was listed under Authorized Shared Access. She clicked Revoke. A pop-up appeared. Are you sure this will permanently remove this user's ability to access or manage your account? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Click. Done. She leaned back in her chair. The air in the room shifted. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. She could almost feel James again, as if he were leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, smirking. About damn time, she could almost hear him say. She closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the kitchen sink. Ran the water, washed the teacup, dried it slowly. Then she went to the living room and picked up the small leather address book. She flipped to the L section. Whitaker Francis, attorney. She hadn't called him in years, not since finalizing the estate paperwork after James passed. But she remembered Francis's steady voice, the quiet competence in his manner. He was the kind of man who never said much but always said the thing that mattered. She picked up the phone and dialed. 1 ring. 2. Whitaker and Associates, this is Vanessa speaking. How may I help you? Vanessa, dear, this is Helen Gardner. I'd like to make an appointment with Mr. Whitaker. It's rather urgent. Yes, of course, Mrs. Gardner. He has availability tomorrow morning at 10:15. Does that work? That works just fine. She hung up. The hum inside her chest didn't fade. It grew. Purpose was returning to her bones. She spent the rest of the evening organizing documents, tax returns, old account statements, notes scribbled from memory about dates and transfers, the ledger of unspoken obligations she'd fulfilled, the ledger of her silence. Somewhere near midnight, she pulled out an old spiral notebook, the kind she used to keep when she was teaching. She wrote in block letters on the first page, Reclamation Plan. Under it, she began a list. Cancel all automated payments. Revoke Daniel's account access. Appointment with Francis. Legal power of attorney. Review will. Protect assets. Reclaim independence. Reclaim dignity. She tapped the pen against the page, thinking. She wasn't just cutting them off financially. She was taking herself back. It had taken one message, just one, to burn down the illusion she had built around herself. But the structure had been rotting for years. The paint was pretty, the floors polished, but the foundation was cracked. Love without respect is not love. It's performance, it's currency. Helen had spent enough. She stood and looked at herself in the mirror over the mantel. The woman staring back looked sharper somehow, less fragile, more steel than lace. Let's see how well they do, she murmured when the ATM walks out. The next morning, as the sun pushed through the blinds, Helen dressed deliberately. A navy blazer, gray slacks, comfortable shoes. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but she was going to look like someone who meant business. She walked out the door without a note, no explanations. She didn't owe one. At the bank, the young man behind the glass partition smiled politely. How can I assist you today, Ms. Gardner? She slid a small folder across the counter. I want all of this, every single transfer halted, permanently. He blinked, flipped through the printouts. There's a lot here. Yes, I know. She leaned forward slightly. I want to be very clear. This is not temporary. This is not a review. This is a termination. I'm done being everyone else's safety net. The banker adjusted his tie. Yes, ma'am. We'll get started on that right away. By the time she stepped out into the crisp morning air, her head was held higher. There were more steps to take, more calls to make, a will to revise, a power structure to dismantle. But for the first time in years, Helen Gardner wasn't reacting. She was acting. And she wasn't just the grandmother, the helper, the afterthought. She was the storm, and she had just taken her first breath. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of day that passed without meaning: cold sky, lukewarm coffee, the faint ache of solitude that settled into Helen Gardner's bones like an old song. She had spent the morning sorting legal documents for her upcoming meeting with Francis Whitaker, highlighting phrases like irrevocable authority and asset protection. She felt sharp, focused, but still alone. By mid-afternoon, she needed a break. The Bluetooth hearing aid James had bought her 6 years before the one Daniel kept urging her to replace had been acting up again. The left one buzzed faint but persistent like a mosquito she couldn't swat. She opened the small gray case, popped it into her laptop via the USB port, and accessed the maintenance software as she'd done dozens of times before. What she wasn't expecting was the log folder that appeared on screen. Voice memo, Dec 1743 mins. Her eyebrows drew together. She didn't recall recording anything on the 17th. She clicked it. The loading bar spun, then silence. And then voices. Her blood chilled. Daniel's voice laughing lightly. Honestly, I'm surprised she hasn't figured it out yet. I mean, she's old, but not that old. Carla replied, voice clipped and sharp. She wants to feel useful. Let her. The more she pays, the less she talks. A pause. Daniel again, softer, now conspiratorial. She's like this living, breathing ATM. Open mouth, insert guilt, and poof, funds appear. Carla laughed cold. God, that's awful. No, it's accurate, Daniel replied. Do you know she still thinks the house is hers? I mean, I told her that to get the check, but come on. Her room smells like mothballs, Carla said. It's like living with a ghost that won't shut up about the past. Helen froze. Her hands still resting on the laptop's edge began to tremble, not with fear, not even with rage. No, this was something else. The kind of tremble that came from seismic clarity, from a realization so final it eclipsed pain. She pressed pause, closed her eyes, and for a moment the room disappeared. The voices still echoed inside her like rotting wood breaking behind wallpaper. She breathed once deeply and opened her eyes. Then she pressed play again, because she needed to hear it all. Every syllable, every betrayal. They talked about her birthday. It wasn't worth the cake and her cleaning habits. She does it wrong anyway. They even mocked the way she signed holiday cards with love from mom as if that were some outdated relic from a bygone century. She listened to the full 43 minutes. And when it ended, she didn't cry. Not like last time. Not like the time she ate her birthday cake alone. No, this time she sat back in her chair and stared at the laptop screen, her mouth a thin straight line. Her eyes, usually soft warm, had gone clear and cold like lake water in January. This wasn't just disrespect. This was strategy. This was exploitation. She clicked save as renamed the file GardnerTape01.wave. Then she copied it to a password-protected USB drive. Then again to a secure cloud folder. She taught kids how to preserve digital evidence. She wasn't about to be careless with her own. Once the file was safely stored, she opened her email. 2 recipients. First, Francis Whitaker, Esquire, subject, urgent, audio evidence. Second, Delia Vance. Delia had been her friend since the PTA days. But more importantly now, she was editor for a digital column that covered elder rights, financial abuse, and generational justice. The last time they had spoken was at a retirement party for another teacher. Delia had mentioned wanting to write a feature series on real documented abuse cases. Helen had smiled politely at the time. Now she smiled with purpose. She attached the audio file and wrote only a few lines. Delia, I believe this is the story you've been waiting to tell. HG. She hit send. Her hands were still steady. That night, she didn't bother cooking. She made a single slice of toast, buttered it, and sat on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her. The Christmas lights still hung from the windows, but she no longer noticed their flicker. Her thoughts were elsewhere, tight, methodical. She replayed the conversation over and over in her head, not the words, but the tone, the casual malice, the practiced cruelty. It was never an accident. She wasn't some dotty old woman who'd misinterpreted things. She had evidence. They didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. The next morning, Delia called. Helen picked up after the first ring. Is it real? Delia asked, no pleasantries? Yes. Are they aware it exists? Not yet. A pause. I want to run with it, Delia said, voice low, intense. Not just the tape, the story, the whole thing. You, the house, the transfers, the betrayal, the silence, the systemic blind spot around elder exploitation in the family unit. Helen nodded slowly, even though Delia couldn't see her. I think it's time, she said. Then we'll protect your name until you're ready. But I'm telling this. People need to hear it. Helen thought of the hundreds of women she knew, women who gave and gave and gave and were repaid in scraps of time and performative affection. I want them to know, she said, her voice steel under silk. I want them to know that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, even if it shakes. The call ended. Helen exhaled. It wasn't revenge, it was release. And clarity. For decades, she had worn her dignity like soft cotton. Now it felt like armor. It didn't matter how polished Daniel and Carla looked on their curated holiday cards. She had pulled the curtain back. They would learn what it felt like to lose control of the narrative. She looked at the reflection of herself in the glass door, aged but upright. Not weak, not invisible. Not anymore. Outside, the snow had stopped. The street was clear. Sunlight glinted off the icicles lining the roof. Inside, Helen's war had already begun. Not loud, not bloody, but exacting. She didn't slam doors, she didn't shout. She sent files, she signed documents, she moved chess pieces Daniel didn't even know existed. Because Helen Gardner wasn't the burden. She was the reckoning. Under normal circumstances, Helen Gardner never would have known what going viral felt like. She didn't have a TikTok account. She barely checked Facebook. Her world was one of paperback novels, handwritten grocery lists, and predictable routines. She liked it that way, quiet, measured, safe. But some truths were too loud to keep safe. The article dropped at exactly 6:00 a.m. She was stirring her coffee when her phone buzzed not once, but twice. Then again and again, like a hive of bees awakening all at once. Her inbox lit up. Missed calls, text messages, notifications from people she hadn't heard from in years. She tilted her head, confused. It was only when she opened her email and saw the subject line, "When a family turns against its own, the ATM mother," that she understood. Delia had published it. And it wasn't just an article. It was a reckoning. The headline was stark black text against a white screen paired with a monochrome photo. A faceless older woman sitting at a holiday table alone, an empty seat to her right. Below it, the words, "They called her a burden. A living ATM, a ghost with mothballs." But what they didn't know was that she had been recording. Helen's breath caught in her chest. The audio file, trimmed anonymized but unmistakable, was embedded right at the top of the story. A few clicks and the reader could hear Daniel's voice laughing, Carla's snide commentary, their complete, almost gleeful disregard for the woman they lived with, the woman who paid their bills. The article didn't name Helen. It didn't need to. The story had already leapt into the bloodstream of the internet. It spread like a match to dry grass. By noon, 5 different social media watchdog pages had shared the piece. A subreddit dedicated to elder rights posted it with the headline, "This is why we need legal reform. Elder abuse is real." But the real explosion happened on a parenting forum, ironically Carla's own territory. A user posted a screenshot of the article with the caption, "Is this about the Carla G who runs H-Conscious Mama Method? The influencer who always brags about family values? Because if it is, I'm canceling my subscription to her baby nutrition guide right now." The comment got 14,000 likes in an hour. The thread grew teeth. Screenshots of Carla's Instagram posts were picked apart. "Look at this one," someone wrote. Caption says, "Grateful for my beautiful, supportive family." Meanwhile, she's telling her MIL to stay home for Christmas. People began tagging her brand sponsors. Nourish Baby Co., are you aware your ambassador referred to her own mother-in-law as a living ATM while cashing her checks for a mortgage? Hey, Daily Glow Skincare, Carla G is profiting from elder abuse. Still proud to have her face on your homepage. By 3 p.m., Carla had shut off comments on all her posts. By 6 p.m., she deleted her Twitter. But it was already too late. Delia's article had been syndicated on 3 national digital magazines by that evening. The story had tapped into something much larger than just Helen. It had uncovered a collective wound. Messages flooded the article's comment section. "My mom gave my sister her retirement fund, and now she's not even invited to birthdays. This is my grandmother's story, word for word, except she didn't have the courage to record it. To whoever this woman is, you're not invisible, you're a warrior." Helen sat at her kitchen table reading quietly. She didn't smile. Not yet, not out of satisfaction. But something shifted deep inside her chest like a key turning or a dam beginning to crack. Then came the hashtag. There was no seat for her. It started as a caption. One woman posted a picture of her elderly mother alone at a kitchen table. Then another, then another. Photos poured in gray-haired women in armchairs, wrinkled hands holding mugs, empty chairs beside them, Christmas trees glowing faintly in the background. The internet had named what Helen hadn't dared say aloud. She had been erased. Not insulted, not even neglected. Erased. By 10 p.m., there was no seat for her was trending across multiple platforms. Helen's phone buzzed again. A message from Delia. "Brace yourself. CNN Lifestyle wants to do a segment. Interested?" Helen stared at the message, then looked around her dim living room. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. But this wasn't about fame. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about being seen, about being heard after years of talking into a void. She typed slowly. "Let's talk tomorrow." Meanwhile, across town, Carla's world was unraveling at a speed she couldn't control. The moment the article dropped, her inbox exploded. Brand managers demanded clarification. Followers demanded answers. PR reps left voicemails layered in urgency and passive aggression. She had tried to spin it at first. She posted a half-hearted story. Not everything you hear online is true. Please respect our family's privacy during this time. That was a mistake. The backlash doubled. No denial. No apology. Just deflection. People smelled the rot beneath the curated filters. By the time her agent called to inform her that Daily Glow and Nourish Baby Co. were terminating contracts effective immediately, Carla had already taken down 3 years of content, but scrubbing the timeline didn't erase the truth. It never does. Daniel hadn't come home until nearly midnight. He had gone to his brother's to clear his head. When he walked in, the kitchen was silent, but the air was razor sharp. Carla was sitting on the edge of the couch, mascara smudged, scrolling furiously through her phone. "They're calling me a monster," she hissed. "A leech. They're dissecting my entire life, our house, my clothes, Abby's school. Someone even dug up that picture of your mom in the background from last Thanksgiving and circled it with a caption that said, 'Find the unpaid maid.'" Daniel didn't speak. Because what could he say? The recording wasn't fake. The words were theirs. All of them. She looked up at him, eyes wild. She planned this. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," she reacted. Carla narrowed her eyes. "We have to do damage control. We have to stop this." Daniel didn't answer, because deep down he knew there was no stopping it now. The truth had breached the walls they'd built, and it had a microphone. Back in her quiet home, Helen finally shut off her phone and moved to the bedroom. She stood at the window watching the night fold in on itself. Somewhere out there, people were saying her name, not in pity, not in mockery, but in solidarity. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. She felt sovereign. And the war hadn't even started. Daniel stood outside the small stone walkway leading to his mother's cottage, shoulders hunched under a puffer jacket, knuckles white as he gripped his phone in one hand. It was the first time he'd come to her place unannounced in over 2 years. The last time had been to install a new water heater she never asked for. But today the heat came from somewhere else entirely. The neighborhood was quiet. No lights twinkled in her windows, just the porch lamp flickering and the sharp winter air curling in his throat. He rang the doorbell once, waited. Twice. Then the door creaked open slowly like a curtain rising on a stage neither actor was ready for. Helen stood there in a wool cardigan, calm, unreadable. Her eyes, always the softest thing about her, were no longer gentle. They were steady, unblinking. "Hi, Mom," he muttered barely above a whisper. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside. Inside the living room was immaculate, clean but not curated. No pretenses, no soft music, no scented candles. Just warmth and order and a silence that pulled the truth from you, whether you liked it or not. Daniel sat on the edge of the sofa. Helen took the armchair across from him, hands folded in her lap like she had during every parent-teacher conference of his childhood. "I saw the article," he said. Still, she didn't speak. I don't know what to say. That audio, it was out of context. We were just venting, Mom. People say things when they're stressed. You know that." Helen's expression didn't move. "You weren't stressed," she said calmly. "You were rehearsed." Daniel blinked. She continued, voice even. "That wasn't one conversation. That was a catalog of contempt. Casual practice cruel." He shook his head, tried a weak smile. "Come on, you know we didn't mean half of that." "You meant enough to say it," she replied. There was a long pause. Daniel cleared his throat. "Look, things have gotten out of hand. Carla's lost 3 sponsorships. Abby's school called about the harassment emails. I'm asking politely that you call off this circus. Remove the story. Issue a statement. Something." Helen tilted her head as if studying him like a case study in her old classroom. "You want me to clean up the mess your choices made?" she asked. Again. Daniel opened his mouth, but she raised one hand, a gesture that silenced him with the weight of decades behind it. "You came here for damage control," she said, "not apology." He leaned forward, voice more urgent now. "Mom, I'm begging you. You've made your point. Isn't that enough?" Helen leaned back. "This isn't about points. This is about pattern. Years of it. I let you take. I let you speak over me. I let you erase me from your holidays, your plans, your family. And I smiled while doing it because I thought love meant endurance." She paused. "It doesn't. Love doesn't demand silence or money or invisibility." Daniel looked like a boy again, cornered, ashamed, not quite ready to admit what he already knew. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he murmured. Helen's gaze hardened. "That's the problem, Daniel. You never mean for things to happen. You just let them." He shifted, uncomfortable. "I don't know what Carla said in that clip," he added. "But she's scared. She's talking about suing for defamation, emotional distress, all that." Helen nodded, unsurprised. "Then she should speak to my lawyer," she said, matter of fact, "because that audio was legally recorded under laws you clearly never thought I'd understand. And the article, it never names you, never shows your faces. If Carla feels identified, perhaps she should reflect on why." Daniel stared at the floor. "You're really doing this." "I already have." He looked up, searching for softness. "I'm your son." She looked at him, quiet, full. "You were," she said. He flinched like she'd struck him. Then Helen stood slowly and walked to a small cabinet in the hallway. She pulled out a manila envelope and returned, placing it gently on the table between them. "This is a copy of the amended will," she said. "Effective immediately, all prior documents are void. A trust has been set up discretionary, not familial. I've made arrangements to transfer the remaining assets into protected status." Daniel stared at it like it might catch fire. "I don't want your money," he whispered. She smiled sad. "But you always did." He stood abruptly, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "I said I was sorry." "No," she said. "You said you were inconvenienced." They stared at each other, two people same bloodline worlds apart. Then without a word, he turned and walked out. The silence that followed was not sad, it was solid. The next day, Helen received an email from Carla's attorney, threatening legal action for malicious interference with public persona and defamatory implication. She forwarded the message directly to Francis Whitaker with a brief note. "Prepare response. Also include counterclaim options, financial elder abuse, unauthorized fiduciary management, reputational exploitation." Francis replied within the hour, already drafting. "They've opened a door they will regret." Helen sat by the window holding her tea. She had once feared the unraveling of the family fabric. Now she saw clearly some fabrics need to be pulled apart before they strangle you. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of truth. Abby stood on the porch of her grandmother's cottage, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her suitcase at her feet. The December wind pulled at her coat, but she didn't shiver. She was too numb for that. Behind her, the sound of tires on gravel faded, her father's car disappearing into the night like a retreating accusation. Helen opened the door, her breath catching at the sight. The last time she had seen Abby was Thanksgiving, when the girl had slipped her a napkin folded into a square with 4 words scrawled in red ink. "I see you, Grandma." And now here she was. Abby, 19, sharp, stubborn, and raw. "Is this a bad time?" she asked. Helen's throat tightened. There's no such thing. She stepped aside. The warmth of the house wrapped around Abby like a secret finally told. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood polish, memories tucked into every corner. They didn't speak much at first. Helen helped her carry the suitcase to the spare room, the one with the faded quilt and the tiny lamp shaped like an owl. Abby placed her backpack beside the bed, then walked back to the living room and sat quietly, the air charged with what wasn't being said. Finally, Helen broke the silence. "Did they say anything when you left?" Abby let out a bitter laugh. "They said I was betraying the family, that I'd let your sob story get to me, that I was too young to understand loyalty." Helen nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "I'm sorry." Abby looked up. "Don't be. They weren't wrong. I am loyal, just not to a lie." Helen leaned forward, her voice gentler now. "You've always seen more than they thought." Abby looked away. "I used to hear them talk about you behind your back. The way Mom would roll her eyes whenever you asked about the electric bill. The way Dad would shut the laptop quickly when you walked into the room like you were interrupting, even when you'd paid for half of it." Helen's fingers tightened around her teacup. "They made it feel like you were something to endure." Abby continued, voice trembling. "Not someone to love." There was silence. Then Helen spoke barely above a whisper. "I wasn't expecting you to take sides." Abby smiled, sad and steady. "I didn't. I just decided which one I didn't want to be." They sat there for a moment, the honesty settling between them like fresh snow. Then Helen said something she hadn't said aloud in years. "I don't need the money, Abby. I never did. What I wanted was presence, conversation, a place at the table." Abby looked up, eyes glossy. "You still want that?" Helen nodded. "More than ever." And something inside Abby cracked open, a dam held too tightly for too long. She leaned forward and hugged her grandmother fiercely, like someone who just found their home again. They stayed that way for a while, two women across generations piecing something back together without the tools of apology or explanation, just truth. Over the next few days, a new rhythm formed. Abby cooked simple meals, grilled cheese, tomato soup, pasta with too much garlic. Helen brewed tea, read out loud from old poetry books, and let herself laugh again. Real laughter. Not polite chuckles. Not the forced kind she used to offer after Carla's passive insults. They walked in the park nearby, Helen's arm looped gently through Abby's. They watched old movies and argued about the endings. Abby helped Helen set up a private blog, Letters from the Chair That Wasn't There, where Helen wrote short reflections on invisibility, aging, and the reclamation of space. To their surprise, the blog gained traction. Readers sent emails, comments. Strangers thanked Helen for putting their pain into words. One woman wrote, "I thought I was crazy for feeling erased. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not." Abby printed that one out and stuck it to the fridge. They weren't just rebuilding. They were becoming something new. And yet the wounds hadn't fully healed. Some nights, Abby would grow quiet, her shoulders tense as she scrolled through her phone, watching her mother post curated throwbacks with captions like "family above all." No mention of her, no trace of Helen. Once Helen asked, "Do you miss them?" Abby answered honestly, "I miss who I thought they were." But healing, they learned, didn't always require resolution. Sometimes it just needed distance and choice. They chose each other. One afternoon, while Abby was studying for her online classes, Helen walked in holding a small box. "This belonged to your great-grandmother," she said, placing it gently on the table. Inside were letters, dozens of them written between 1939 and 1945. Wartime letters filled with longing, love, and fear. Abby picked one up, unfolding it carefully. "She was a writer?" she asked. "She was a woman who refused to be quiet." Helen smiled. Abby grinned. "Runs in the blood." Later that evening, as snow began to fall again outside the window, Abby posted a photo of Helen's hand resting over her own, with the caption, "We don't inherit silence, we break it." There was no seat for her, and now she sits at the head. The post went viral, but this time not for outrage, for reverence. People began to share stories of their own grandmothers, their own family breakaways, their own battles to be heard. The hashtags returned, but now they were laced with hope. Elder Voices' legacy reclaimed the new family table. Helen sat beside Abby that night, watching the numbers grow, not in followers, but in voices, in echo, in resonance. Abby looked over and asked, "Do you feel seen now?" Helen reached over and squeezed her hand. "No," she said, "I feel chosen." And for the first time in years, she slept with the lights off, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she no longer needed to watch the shadows. She had a witness now, a co-conspirator, and a new seat at a table they were building together, one story at a time. Helen sat upright on the oak bench of the courtroom, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly over her lap. The sound of murmurs echoed like distant thunder around her, punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel moments earlier. Fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow, but Helen's presence, rooted unshakable, made the space feel anything but cold. Directly across from her sat Daniel and Carla, both dressed as if they'd been advised by expensive lawyers to look humble. Daniel in a navy suit that fit too tight across his shoulders, Carla in an ivory blouse buttoned too high, lips tight as thread. They weren't handcuffed. Not yet. But the tension in their posture suggested they were already shackled by something far heavier: exposure. This was the preliminary hearing, a formal examination of the evidence Helen's legal team had spent weeks compiling. But in truth, this courtroom had been assembled long before the judge entered, formed from every digital share, every comment thread, every stranger who had reposted the clip and whispered, "This could be my mother." The bailiff called the case Gardner v. Gardner, allegations of elder financial abuse and fiduciary misconduct. Helen's attorney, Francis Whitaker, rose from his seat with a calm confidence that could silence oceans. "Your Honor," he began, "what we bring before this court is not a question of confusion or family drama, but a pattern of exploitation, quiet, deliberate, and calculated, inflicted upon Mrs. Helen Gardner, a 73-year-old widow, by her immediate family." He clicked a remote and the overhead screen came to life. Slide 1, a photo of Helen's former home, a modest 2-bedroom property in a quiet suburb she had owned for over 40 years. Slide 2, a wire transfer receipt showing $212,400 moved from Helen's account to a joint escrow with Daniel and Carla for a home purchase. Slide 3, the agreement Daniel had drafted on an iPad the day the house was bought, with the note, "Mom, this is your home too. You'll never be alone again." Underneath it, Helen's signature, shaky but trusting. Gasps rippled softly through the courtroom. Whitaker continued, "We will show that from the moment that transfer was complete, Mrs. Gardner was gradually removed from financial and emotional decision-making, that her role in the household was reduced to that of an unacknowledged caregiver, cook, and errand runner, that promises were made to mask the true intention to drain her of security while denying her dignity." He clicked again. Slide 4, a transcript from a conversation recorded via Helen's hearing aid device. The infamous line, "She's like a vending machine that never breaks. You just press a button and she pays the bills." Carla's face flushed. Whitaker let the silence land before he continued. "There's more than just financial abuse here, Your Honor. There's emotional coercion. There's manipulation. And there's gross negligence in fiduciary responsibility. My client's accounts were co-managed without her full awareness, and we have digital trails to prove it." The judge nodded, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Then it was the defense's turn. Carla's attorney stood, a man with too much confidence for someone holding too few cards. "Your Honor, this is a family matter, a tragic misunderstanding that's been escalated far beyond what it needs to be. My clients maintain that all financial decisions were made with Mrs. Gardner's consent. She was never denied access to her funds. In fact, they've supported her consistently." Helen's lips curled slightly. "Supported? That's what they called leaving her birthday cake in a grocery bag on the counter." The lawyer rambled on, citing text messages where Helen had said things like, "Thank you for handling the bills," as proof of consent. But context matters. And when they rested, Whitaker stood again. "Let's not pretend politeness is the same as permission. A woman thanking her son for handling the bills after he's taken over her accounts is not affirmation, it's a survival tactic." Then came the moment. The court allowed Helen to speak. She stood slowly, a soft rustle in her long navy coat the only sound. Her voice was even but carried weight. I taught for 42 years, she began, and I always told my students, you don't get to take the test and then say you didn't know it was coming. That's what's happening here. She turned eyes locking with Carla's. You didn't invite me to your Christmas table, Carla. Said it was for family. But here we are in a room filled with strangers watching what family really looks like under a microscope. She walked slowly toward the center of the floor. When I gave you that money, I wasn't investing in property, I was investing in people. In the idea that I still belonged. Helen turned toward the judge. I was told more times than I can count that this is your home too. But every time I spoke, they acted like I'd interrupted something. Every time I cooked, they acted like it was expected. And every time I stayed quiet, they called it grace. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag. She pulled out a printed page. I'd like to read an excerpt from something my granddaughter helped me write, part of a blog that now has over 80,000 followers. Just a few lines, if I may. The judge nodded. Helen's voice was softer now, but firmer than steel. It's not that I didn't belong at the table. It's that they never planned to set a chair for me. Not because there wasn't space, but because they didn't think I'd mind standing. She folded the page. But I minded, she whispered. The courtroom was silent. Even Daniel looked down. Helen returned to her seat. The judge called for a short recess. As people began to move, Carla stood slowly and walked toward Helen, hesitant eyes wide. Are you proud of this? She hissed, voice low. Dragging your family through the mud. You could have just talked to us. Helen didn't flinch. I did. You didn't listen. Carla's voice cracked, desperate. Do you know what you've done to my reputation? Helen looked up serene. I gave it a microphone. Behind her, Abby placed a hand on her grandmother's shoulder, and Carla finally understood. This wasn't a war she could win with apologies or charm, because this wasn't about being forgiven. It was about being seen. When the court reconvened, the judge's statement was concise. There is clear evidence of financial misconduct, manipulation, and willful misrepresentation of fiduciary duty. This court finds reasonable grounds to proceed to full civil trial. In the meantime, Mrs. Gardner's financial assets will be placed under protected trusteeship, and Daniel Gardner and Carla Gardner are hereby restricted from accessing any joint accounts pending further investigation. Carla gasped. Daniel slumped. But Helen, she just breathed. Fully, for the first time in years. The system had looked her in the eye and said, we see you. She walked out of this courtroom into the afternoon sun. Abby at her side, the weight on her shoulders exchanged for something far more powerful. Dignity. Helen sat beneath the harsh lights of the television studio, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel exposed. Her hands were folded gently in her lap. Microphone clipped to her cardigan, eyes locked on the red light that blinked above the camera like a heartbeat. A producer gave the silent countdown behind the glass, 3 fingers, 2, 1, then pointed. The host's voice came through soft and reverent. Tonight on Evening Forum, we speak with Helen Gardner, a woman whose quiet strength and remarkable courage have sparked a national conversation about elder abuse, financial exploitation, and what it really means to be family. Helen didn't flinch. She met the lens with calm steadiness, the same look she'd used as a teacher decades earlier when a room of 12-year-olds needed to believe someone had the answers. The host turned toward her. Helen, first of all, thank you for being here. You've become somewhat of a symbol in recent weeks. Your story has gone viral, and many people say it's given voice to something they've lived silently. How does it feel to become a movement? Helen smiled faintly. I never set out to become anything more than a woman who'd had enough, she said. But if people saw themselves in my silence and now in my refusal to stay silent, then maybe it's because this story isn't just mine. It's a pattern that's been repeating in too many homes for too long. The host nodded solemnly. You've spoken in your blog about being erased in your own family. That hits people hard. What do you want others, especially younger generations, to understand? Helen glanced to the side for a moment, collecting her thoughts, then turned back. That love doesn't excuse neglect, she said simply. And that financial help isn't permission to be treated like furniture. We age, yes, but we don't disappear. If anything, we become more ourselves, just with less tolerance for disrespect. The audience behind the cameras let out a collective hum of agreement. The host leaned forward. And now you've partnered with the Protect Our Elders campaign. Can you tell us about that? Helen nodded. It's a national initiative to educate seniors on their financial rights, provide free legal aid, and give them the tools to say no even when it's family asking. I wish I'd had it sooner, but I'm proud to be part of it now. As the interview closed, the host asked one final question. If Carla or Daniel are watching tonight, what would you say to them? Helen looked directly at the lens. I hope you learn that consequences are not cruelty. I hope you understand that what you lost wasn't money, it was trust. And I hope one day you treat silence not as an opportunity to take, but as a warning. When the segment aired that night, millions watched. And among them in boardrooms, nursing homes, libraries, and college dorms, something began to shift. That same week, Helen received a letter. It arrived in a cream envelope with gold-embossed letters, Silver Anchor Foundation. Inside a handwritten note, Mrs. Gardner, your story has not only moved us, it has redefined what we believe is possible when one voice breaks through decades of silence. We'd be honored to name you our national ambassador. We believe your message delivered with such grace and fire can help us reach thousands more. With admiration, Monica Reyes, executive director. Abby was the first to read it. She jumped from the kitchen stool, waving the letter like a flag. Grandma, you've been recruited. Helen laughed deep from her chest, the kind of laugh that shakes off dust from years past. That weekend, they flew to Chicago for the Silver Anchor Summit. Helen, in a navy blazer and pearl earrings she hadn't worn since her retirement party, stood before an audience of 200 mostly senior citizens, some with walkers, others in wheelchairs, all with eyes sharper than they'd been given credit for. She took the stage without notes. My name is Helen Gardner, she began. I used to believe silence was a form of grace. I believed if I didn't complain, if I stayed useful, if I kept giving, then I would always belong. But then one Christmas, my son told me there wasn't a chair for me at the table, and that night I stopped asking to be included. She paused, letting the words settle. I realized I had one power left: the truth, and so I used it. I told my story not for revenge, but for recognition. And something miraculous happened. You all answered. Applause rose, not loud, but thunderous in its emotion. Afterward, person after person lined up to speak to her. I'm you. My son's doing the same thing. My daughter controls my pension. I haven't bought my own groceries in years. You gave me permission to be angry. Helen listened to each of them, holding their hands, looking them in the eye. She wasn't a celebrity. She was a mirror. Back in her hometown, things had changed too. The local paper ran the headline, "From a Race to Empowered, Our Helen Leads National Advocacy." At the local library, her blog was printed out and displayed in the community section. Teenagers volunteered to teach basic tech skills to seniors, starting a workshop series called Click to Be Heard. And at the town hall, a motion passed to install a hotline for elder financial abuse, with Helen's quote etched beneath it. Silence isn't safety, it's surrender. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for the woman whose son forged her checks, the grandfather forced into a nursing home to make room, the widow who sold her wedding ring to pay her grandson's debts. Helen gave their pain a platform, and in doing so gave herself a purpose. Abby watched her grandmother's world grow larger. Radio interviews, newspaper columns, Zoom talks with college students studying ethics and intergenerational equity. But through it all, Helen never stopped making tea at 3 p.m., never stopped folding Abby's laundry with perfect corners, never stopped being the woman who once thought her story didn't matter. Now it was changing lives, and maybe just maybe changing the ending for someone else. The divorce was quiet, at least at first, just a short blurb buried in the back of a local tabloid. Carla Gardner files for divorce, cites irreconcilable differences. But Helen didn't need a headline to know what was coming. She saw it in the silence, in the way Daniel stopped returning calls, in the way even Carla's Instagram feed, once flooded with curated family dinners and filtered smiles, had gone dark. Carla's filing wasn't for peace, it was for survival. And she wanted the world to know whose fault it was. In the legal documents, she described Daniel as irresponsible, weak, and unable to protect family interests. But one line in particular stood out to Helen when it was leaked. He let everything slip into the hands of that old woman. That old woman. Helen read it once, folded the paper, and laughed, a low knowing sound that echoed in her chest. Carla had always valued narrative control, but this time, she wasn't the one holding the pen. The spiral was fast. Without Carla's carefully crafted image and management, Daniel couldn't keep up with payments. The house once bought with Helen's savings was now teetering on foreclosure. Helen had long since removed her name from the deed. She watched from afar as notices piled up. Abby showed her a screenshot of the foreclosure auction. Daniel never reached out, not even once. The job he once held in finance secured more through nepotism than talent dried up, as whispers of the scandal reached upper management. No one wanted the man whose mother had gone national with stories of financial betrayal representing their firm. Helen didn't celebrate his downfall, but she didn't mourn it either. She had mourned already for years, mourned the son who had slowly reshaped her worth into utility, who measured affection by balance sheets and reduced her presence to obligation. The only grief that remained now was a ghost she had learned to coexist with. Life didn't slow for the ruin of others. In Helen's world, it bloomed. Abby visited every Sunday, always with fresh apples, sometimes with basil she grew in her apartment window. She and Helen had started a garden together behind the cottage. It wasn't big, just enough to hold carrots, mint tomatoes, and a trellis of climbing beans, but it was sacred. They didn't just grow food, they grew stories. I want to teach kids here, Abby said one morning, brushing soil from her palms. Not just about planting, about voices, about the way silence gets taught and how to unlearn it. Helen nodded, watering the roots gently. And that's how it began. At first, it was just a handful of children, 3 siblings from down the road whose mother worked double shifts at the diner, a boy with thick glasses who carried his notebook everywhere, and a shy girl who never spoke, only drew. Helen and Abby set up folding chairs, built a chalkboard out of salvaged wood, and called it the free classroom. Word spread. Soon there were a dozen children every Saturday. Some came to read, others came just to sit. Helen taught them about history, not the names and dates, but the stories, the choices, the silence that swallowed women like her for generations, and how they could choose even now to be louder. Abby brought in books about justice and kindness, lessons about empathy wrapped in games and journals. Parents stopped by with home-cooked meals and handwritten thank you notes. One woman, barely 35 but with eyes older than Helen's, said simply, "You saved my daughter." There was no grant, no nonprofit name, no official sponsor. Just 2 women, one healing, one learning, changing a corner of the world together. Every now and then, Helen would hear rumors about Daniel, that he was living in a rented room above a tire shop, that he'd applied for a loan and been denied, that he'd started drinking too much and showing up late to whatever part-time jobs he scraped together. She never sought him out. Forgiveness wasn't a bridge she owed him. It was a garden she was building without him. But sometimes she dreamed, not about reconciliation, not about apologies, but about one simple thing, that he would one day understand the weight of a chair left empty and the echo it made when someone chose never to return to it. One late afternoon, as the sun slanted low and the beans cast long shadows across the fence, Abby sat beside Helen, watching the children laugh. "Do you ever wish it ended differently?" she asked softly. Helen didn't respond right away. She watched a girl in a pink jacket leap over a chalk-drawn hopscotch grid, her laughter ringing out like a hymn. "I wish it began differently," Helen said, "but not how it ended." Abby nodded. There were days Helen still felt the sting, still woke up expecting the old ache. But now those days were followed by tomato vines, small hands holding books, and Abby's presence solid, radiant, and uncompromising. Some endings don't need reunions. Some just need roots. Helen had never planned to live by the sea. The idea had always sounded indulgent, something for poets, painters, or the endlessly romantic. But when the little one-bedroom apartment came up for rent just a few blocks from the shore, she'd said yes before she had time to second-guess it. It wasn't luxurious. The paint peeled in spots along the window frame, and the water heater grumbled like an old man with a grudge. But it had light, soft golden light that spilled across her wooden floors every morning and danced on her kitchen counter like a silent hymn. Most importantly, it had quiet. Not the empty quiet of being ignored, but the chosen kind. The kind you earn after surviving a storm and watching it pass. Every morning, Helen walked the sand barefoot, feeling the cool bite of it against her soles. She carried a bag with chalk notebooks and granola bars. By 9 a.m., the kids would come, some local, some from neighborhoods where parents worked too long for too little. They gathered on a patch of grass just past the dunes under the slanting shade of a weathered cypress tree. There were no desks, no uniforms, just curiosity and space to be heard. She taught them letters, yes, but also stories, morals, how to read between the lines of fairy tales and ask, but what did the stepmother feel? One boy, Sam, couldn't write his name when they met. By week 6, he was writing poems, mostly about his dog and the ocean, sometimes about the color of sadness. Another girl, Miriam, carried a notebook like armor. Helen helped her fill it with questions, each one more courageous than the last. It wasn't a school. It was a beginning. Sometimes Helen would pause mid-sentence, gaze drifting toward the waves. The crash of the surf didn't interrupt her thoughts, it harmonized with them. She wasn't teaching for the paycheck anymore. She was teaching because it was the one thing that had always made her feel most herself. And then came the envelope. It was Abby's handwriting, round and slightly crooked, still defiant against lined paper. Helen opened it slowly, seated in her wicker chair by the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hand. Inside was the acceptance letter from a university. Abby had applied to the College of Education, majoring in childhood development and community teaching. At the bottom of the letter, Abby had scrawled, "You're the reason I chose this. I want to be like you, but louder." Helen read it twice, then placed it against her chest. The tears came quietly. Not the kind that broke, but the kind that healed. Later that afternoon, Abby arrived with her backpack bouncing against her hip, breathless with pride. "I wanted to tell you in person," she said, dropping the bag and rushing into Helen's arms. "You did," Helen replied, hugging her tighter than she had in years. "You told me in the way you live." They walked together down to the shore that evening, the sun beginning its descent into a blaze of amber. Waves rolled in with rhythm like an old song neither of them needed to name. Abby sat in the sand, legs stretched out, shoes forgotten. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly. "The house, everything." Helen shook her head slowly. "I miss the idea of it," she said, "the version I thought was true. But what I have now, this light, this ocean, this you, it's more than enough." The wind picked up, tugging gently at Abby's scarf. "You taught me that it's okay to walk away from a table when no one leaves you a chair," Abby said. Helen smiled. And you taught me that it's okay to set up a new table on a beach with no chairs at all. They both laughed the kind of laugh that floats weightless. In time, word of Helen's beach lessons spread. Retired teachers began to reach out asking how they could replicate it in their own towns. A local nonprofit offered supplies. One university professor even invited Helen to guest lecture on liberated learning models. But she kept her classes simple, always on the grass, always with heart. On the morning of her 74th birthday, the kids surprised her with a mural. Painted in chalk across the grass, it read, "Ms. Helen, you taught us more than letters, you taught us voice." She stood in the center of it, hands trembling not from age but from wonder. Abby lit a single candle in a cupcake and held it out. "Make a wish," she said. Helen closed her eyes. But this time she didn't wish for acceptance. She didn't wish for her son to call. She didn't wish for a chair at any old table. She wished for the sun to stay warm, for Abby to stay brave, for the children's questions to get bigger, not smaller. She blew out the candle and smiled. She was home. The house stood just as she remembered, grand, polished but cold. The for sale sign swayed slightly in the winter wind, its red letters half faded by sun and rain. Helen stepped out of the rideshare, clutching her wool coat closed with one hand and a notebook pressed to her chest with the other. She didn't approach the front steps. She didn't need to. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk where the brick path once felt like a welcome mat. Now it looked like a trail that had never led home. The windows were dark, the porch lights off. Behind those glass panes had once lived her hopes, a quiet room, a chair by the fireplace, laughter on holidays. The illusion of family. She walked slowly to the edge of the lawn, stopping near the window that once faced the dining room. Her reflection looked back at her, faintly filtered through memories. It was here, wasn't it? This window. That night. The soft jazz playing inside, the clinking of silverware, the laughter that never made space for her. She had stood on this same patch of grass, dressed in her best, holding a casserole dish in foil until the text came through. Mia homne latiek bendanoi, mio nanyingoine. No seat, no explanation, no room for the woman who gave up everything to make sure her son had a life she never allowed herself to dream of. Now the house was empty, but Helen was not. She stared through the glass beyond the empty rooms, beyond the memories, and smiled. Not with bitterness, not with triumph. With clarity. Back then she said aloud to no one and everyone, "They didn't save me a seat at the table." She looked down at her shoes, the dirt soft beneath them, then back to the house. "But now, I built the whole stage." Her words didn't echo, they simply landed, like truth. She turned without hesitation, walking away from the house. With every step, her spine straightened, her shoulders relaxed. And by the time she reached the car, she no longer felt like a visitor to her own past. Later that evening, back in her small beachside apartment, she sat near the window. The sun was setting low and orange, melting into the ocean. Waves whispered against the shore. Wind moved through the curtains gently, like fingers parting pages. She opened her journal. It was leather-bound, gifted to her by Abby after the university acceptance letter. "Start again," Abby had said, "but this time write it your way." Helen uncapped her pen and began to write. This is not the story of a woman erased. This is the story of a woman who remembered herself piece by piece, voice by voice, truth by truth. This is the story of a chair I never got, but more importantly, the one I chose never to wait for again. She paused, tapping the pen lightly against her lip. Outside, she could hear the muffled joy of children still playing by the shore. A dog barked once. Somewhere distant, music drifted from a neighbor's radio. She kept writing. At 73, I learned that it's not too late to begin again. That silence is not the same as peace. That dignity isn't something you get from family, it's something you reclaim for yourself when the world forgets you ever had it. The final line she underlined twice. Age didn't weaken me, it stripped the illusions away. She signed the date at the bottom, Helen Gardner, 73 years young. Then she closed the book, set it on the nightstand, and leaned back in her chair. The camera would pull out now if this were a film, fade wide, catching the quiet glow of the lamp behind her, the rustle of the sea outside, the silhouette of a woman once silenced, now fully written in. A voiceover not hers but ours would whisper over the final frame. At 73, she finally started to live, and then cut to black.